had some questions about the theory of evolution even at that time. And what particularly surprised me was what I considered to be a lack of interest in discussing the problems of evolution. And that didn't strike me particularly as good science. I'll share you a little bit of my story in this talk. So anyway, I thought I'd start off with a picture of, wow. In fact, you know what? Is there any way you can dim the lights up front here maybe? I know I'm a good-looking guy to look at, but I think I'd rather you have a look at the slides. So, and is there any way we can kill these lights up here, these mood lights? Thank you. I don't want the mood, yes, Anyway, thank you. I appreciate that very much. So, take a look at this. This is a deep space picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. They were purposely looking for a place that was dark in the sky. And let's see, I'm not used to this pointer, but let's see. Is it working? It is, let's see. How do you get the light? Isn't it the middle one? Oh, let's try that one. No? Okay, well anyway. Which are the pointer ones?
Oh, the pointer's this one. But it is on? Yeah, it's on. All right.
Okay, now it's on. Okay, the pointer is this one. He said, I do not have the pointer. I want to point. I'll tell you what, see this? See the lower right picture there with the star that's asteroided like this. You see that? Okay, there's one up in the upper left. You see that? There are two stars in that picture. Only two. The rest are galaxies. Every other source of light you see in that picture is a galaxy. Now, a galaxy on average has 200 billion stars in it. In that particular picture, if you could see it as clearly as that monitor back there, creak your necks a little bit and take a look at that picture. Look at the clarity of that one. Whoops, you just advanced it. There it is. There are 10,000 galaxies in that picture. Now, if you were to take a pen, like a big pen, hold it at arm's length, the tip of that pen is the width of field that you're looking at there. So that much, a tiny pen tip contains 10,000 galaxies. Yeah, red one? Oh, look at that. Hey, we got a pointer. So right there is a star, and right there is a star. See that? So, recently, the University of Nottingham in England decided to redo the study on how many galaxies we have in the universe. They came back with the conclusion of add a zero to the previous number. There are now considered to be 2 trillion galaxies. Times 200 billion stars per is 400 septillion stars. 400 septillion stars in the known universe. Now, there was a mathematician who saw that and said, okay, I know what the next question is, I'm on it. So he started studying, did calculations of every beach on planet Earth and how much grains of sand there would be per beach. Came with this announcement, there are more stars in the sky than grains of sand on every beach on planet Earth. Now, if you ever think of yourself as pretty impressive, you're pretty hot stuff. You take a look at a summer sky with no moon and take a look at the starry skies, and you may have a slightly different view. A really good question that I'm waiting for evolutionists to ask, because usually ask other questions as a counter to creationism. I'm waiting for them to ask the following question: what is man that thou art mindful of him? As David penned in a song. Why would you Christians even think that if there's a God who made all of that, he could care less about us? Why, how do you get that? That is a reasonable question. Okay, let's go. Here we go. So let's talk about in the beginning God or hydrogen. Astronomer Carl Sagan believed what his mentor Harlow Shapley said, that some piously record in the beginning God, but I say in the beginning hydrogen. Remember the Carl Sagan series way back when on television about the cosmos? Anyway, he thinks in the beginning hydrogen. In other words, in the beginning there was no God. So, we're going to talk today about this. What's this? The great old question, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay. Well, no less a person than this said, for every human there is a quest to find the answer to why I am here. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? For me, that became the most important thing in my life. Everything else is secondary. And that was, of course, a Beatle who said that. You'd think everything is going for him in this life. Nope, he wanted to know. We're all knowing. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Am I alone? All of these questions are fundamental to the question of origins. Right? It's absolutely central to this subject. So that's why it's so interesting to me. Some years ago, I was pastoring a church in a university area in Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington. Of course, you may know there's two giant universities in the middle of nowhere in the Palouse, and lots of intellectuals there. I wrote an article in the paper, and I expected some pushback when I suggested that faith is required for all models of origins, faith. Well, that was pushing a button, so somebody wrote a letter back, and here it is. And you could tell there's a little tension to it. They said this: no faith is required for a principle supported by overwhelming evidence so successful in its application. So, and this is what they added, science is in fact compatible with religious faith. It is not, however, compatible with what? Ignorance. There's a little shot right there, okay? A little, yeah. Okay? I was pushing his button. And the fact of the matter is, we all push each other's buttons when we talk about these subjects. Cosmology. What is a cosmology? A cosmology is your view of what's out there. The forces. Is there a God? Yes, no. It will affect how you view everything. Seems like science and faith and religion have been fighting. You get National Geographic saying that there's a war on science if you disagree with questions of climate change, or worse yet, evolution. If you disagree with some of the tenets of evolution, you are battling science. Well, religion also feels sometimes, is there a war on religion? So, incidentally, you can tell I use humor whenever I can, frankly, because of two reasons. Number one, that's me. But number two, I try to use it to ease the tensions in the air. Because there's always a defensiveness when we talk about these things that's tangible. You can feel it. And so, to the extent that I can loosen and lighten things up and say, hey, let's just talk, you'd think that would be easy to do in a university setting. Very difficult in a university setting, believe it or not. So a cosmology affects how you view a lot of different things. Suffering, how you view warfare, how you view science, of course, and faith, how you view the earth and where it came from. And most definitely, your worldview will affect how you view images of God. Is he involved, yes or no? Is he off doing other things, or is he close by, if he exists at all? And all of this affects your worldview, how you interpret data even. So like I said, I was in this university town, and I'd see a lot of these Darwin lizards on bumpers, you know, in different logos. And you can see, because they use the lizard logo, you can tell there's a little bit of a back at you to Christians. So, in America, what is Americans' view of where we came from? Gallup polls have been taken about every 3 years or so on this subject for a long time. The last two, 14 and 17, here's the 14 response. How many of you believe we came from a recent creation, which was a biblical view? 42% of Americans. 31% believed in theistic evolution. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. And then 19% believed in natural evolution. In other words, no God, nature's enough to make itself and organize itself. Okay, now that's 2014. Doesn't add up to 100% because some people don't have opinions. Okay, anyway, I don't know. I've never met one yet, but they must be out there. 2017, there was a little drop in creation, but a rise in theistic evolution and natural evolution still at 19%. The 19% is heavily influenced by young people today, because young people think it's cool and intellectually responsible to be atheist. Why? Because they look at the world and they say religion is fundamental to a lot of the wars going on. Would you not say there's some truth to that? And so a lot of them just go that way, which is sad. For 100 years or so, poll taking, it was around 10%, but it's bumped up a little bit in recent years. Okay, so what is theistic evolution? Incidentally, these numbers drive science leaders in our country absolutely bonkers. But anyway, fact of the matter is Americans still believe God got us here some way or other. What is theistic evolution? Basically that Darwin was correct, but God is doing it. Okay? So God is taking care of the problems. He's fixing it, he's driving it, he's doing whatever. He's somehow using evolution to create man and all the species we have here. So, point is, you will not see any other Western country with numbers anywhere approaching this. To see this high of a view of creation, incidentally, tied for first. And second is theistic evolution, which of these three views only can be taught in public schools? Natural evolution only. So do you think we'll have some impact, some fights in board settings and such with the public? But anyway, so theistic evolution is held by people with a high view of science. They believe we've gotten so many wonderful things from science. They have a high view, but they also have a high view of religion. So trying to mesh the two into believing that God of the Bible or something used evolution to get us here. And don't think about the ramifications, and try not to. And frankly, you can meet people that do this. I put science in this part of my brain, I put religion in this part of my brain, and I try to never cross those lines when I think about such things. Anyway, so real quickly, here are the basic views of how we got here. Most all of you will fall into one of these boxes. I hate to box you, but I'm in a box too. All of us are either going to believe in creation by a biblical view of a recent done, and the fossil record represents the flood. A gap theory in which God created 6 days recently, but before that there was maybe the age of the dinosaurs and God decided to start over again or something. That's a gap theory, and there's lots of gap theories. Progressive creation is God uses long ages, but in between those millions of years, there are instances where he creates something here. Now, Christians believe that. Theistic evolution, God directs evolution. Deistic evolution is God started everything with some kind of miraculous life form creation, and then it sort of evolves on its own naturally without his involvement. Space ancestry is that life came from some other place. And this is held by scientists who believe that we don't have enough time in 4 billion years in this planet. And so they think it must have come from some older place. And this could even include little green men and spaceships. And there's been Nobel Prize winners who believe that. So anyway, and then of course evolution by itself, no God, long ages, and nature again is able to create itself. So if God created anything, what did he create? Did he create simply matter, organic molecules, a simple life form? Did he create something kind of close to us, like the way I have him reaching out there? Or God created man, by the Bible says, or God had nothing to do with us being here at all. And trust me on this, as I share my own story with my geology major professor, some people believe that, or have a hard time with it. Now, just to show you the religious leanings of the leaders of this is basically science education. These are the ones that determine what the curriculum is in our schools. What is their religious belief? And this is according to Nature magazine, trust me, not a creation magazine at all. How many of them believe in God, personal God? Only 7%. How many disbelieve in personal God? Now, that's not don't know. That's our sure there's no God, 72%. And then the rest are 21%, which is agnostic, have doubt. So you will not find a higher percentage of atheism, frankly, in just about any other segment of society. It's a very high. So how can they not reflect their views when they're determining science curriculum? It'd be very hard for them to. It'd be hard for you. So what is science? Science is knowledge. It's a Latin word for knowledge. And I like that when I'm talking with a group of students, I'd like to say, how many of you are science majors? They raise their hands. How many of you are other majors? And others raise their hands. And I said, did you realize that you're studying something that's not knowledge? You're a non-knowledge major. I usually get a little reaction. It's kind of fun. Now, here's a problem. Religion is supposed to tell us how to go to heaven, and science tells us how the heavens go, but the problem is both sides are curious to know where the heavens come from. And that's where we clash. It is possible to do good science if you have a Christian background. It'd be very difficult to find a person with a higher IQ historically than Isaac Newton, maybe even 200. No sciences are better tested than the religion of the Bible. And the great astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler said that, oh my God, I think thy thoughts after thee. Who's this guy? This is Galileo, the famous astronomer. And you remember that Galileo got religion and science both in the same article, didn't he? When he argued with the usual belief that the sun is the center of the universe. He argued for Copernicus's view, and he got pulled into the carpet on this by the church. And this has usually been used as example number one. Science and religion clash. Religion stay away from science. However, what you don't know in the history of this story was that Galileo was first of all argued against by scientists. And this is one of his fellow scientists who said this when Galileo said that the earth is actually moving around the sun. Animals which move have limbs and muscles. The earth has no limbs and muscles, hence it does not move. Okay, there's good science. And that's a science that Galileo was dealing with back in his day. So they could not get Galileo to change his mind. And so then they called the church leadership to get him to stop. And the church did. So, and you know this story, right? Pulled in and he was told, do not talk about the earth not being the center of the universe. The Bible doesn't say the earth is the center of the universe, but anyway, that was a belief at the time. Now, let's talk about three great scientists who kind of changed, let's say, the direction of views on these subjects. First of all, let's start with Aristotle. Could be the father of modern science, or at least proto-science. Aristotle had a story on how the gods had made the earth, a narrative. And he knew the narrative, but he thinks, no, I don't think so. Let's just observe. We'll use observation to just look and try to figure out what's going on out there. Newton also had a narrative, the Bible, but he said, let's use the Bible and we will observe nature and come to a conclusion. Darwin had the Bible, the narrative, but he rejected a narrative and went back to the Greek view of let's just simply observe and try to make sense of what we see. So, did you know that the Greeks pretty much believed in evolution? Take a look. All living things change over time. There was a hierarchical view by Aristotle, and even the fittest of biological mutations survive. That's pure Darwin, 2,000 years before. Anyway, that's kind of interesting. Just throw that in. Now, who is Darwin? Darwin's the man. Darwin is the guy. Every year at the University of Idaho, they would have a Darwin on the Palouse celebration at the university and call in speakers and celebrate the contributions of Darwin. Darwin's a brilliant man, great in terms of his science. He was a great observer of nature. He was an excellent observer. You cannot take away his abilities in science. His conclusions are where we have some disagreements. But Charles Darwin, who was he? Well, first of all, you know the story, or know a little bit of the story of how he set sail on the HMS Beagle, which was a British map-making tour for the government of Britain to go around the world and map some places that hadn't been mapped before. He signed on as the boat's naturalist, call it scientist, and companion to the captain. They thought it was going to be a 3-year tour. It was more like 5. Anyway, while he was on that trip, he made some observations from nature, in particular the Galapagos Islands. And eventually, and he actually wrote the manuscript in 1844, he published it in 1859, Origin of Species. That's the book. That changed the time. We'll talk about that just a little bit. What did Darwin see on his trip? When he got to the Galapagos Islands, the crew and he went over to the local Safeway market to buy food for the crew. And when they went in there to the meat section, they were offered tortoises for sale. Yum! Well, okay. He noticed that the natives were talking about different islands that they were from, and he said, how can you tell that they're from different islands? So the different shape of the shells, the different shaped shells will tell you what island they're from. And I said, well, that's interesting. How did they have different shapes based on where they came from? Then he also, of course, collected the famous birds. Took them back to England. He was not a bird expert. He asked some friends about these birds. And they told him, oh, these are all finches. So how can they be all finches? Look at the difference in the beaks. Say, yeah, no, they're all finches. And the beaks were able to, depending upon what island they came from, the big beak was good for crunching hard nuts, hard seeds, and the smaller beaks were used for other sources of food. And he imagined, and incidentally, even creationists correctly say this, he imagined that they had a common ancestor, finch, that eventually somehow changed or adapted to different environments. But they were still finches. Anyway, so he came back with the idea that maybe things change. What he saw was what we would call microevolution, little changes within a species. What he assumed, and first of all, you got to get one thing before this assumption. They were just talking now in the science world about the world being old. And Charles Lyell, the famous geologist, wrote and said maybe the world is maybe 1, maybe 2 million years old. That was a lot of time for them. So if Darwin is imagining little changes, but he had a lot of time for those changes to accumulate, then he could imagine what we would call macroevolution, and that is major changes of one kind of critter into another. Okay? That's the idea. So we assumed macroevolution. Now this is way before genetics were understood at all. Back in those days, they thought that a human body was made up of boxes. Little tiny boxes, containers called cells. And in those cells were jelly called protoplasm. Now, if you look in the mirror on a given day, you can sort of see how they would think we were made out of jelly. I can see how they would come up with that. But that was pretty much the extent of genetics for them at the time. Had no concept of how complex things were genetically. So he just assumed everything changed over time. So he wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Let's talk about what that is. This is Darwin's contribution. Already people are believing in evolution. Evolution was already pretty well set in the Western intellectual world, okay? Scholarly world. What they didn't have for it was a mechanism. What makes it change? And this is what Darwin proposed, natural selection. Here's what he was aware of. He grew up in England, probably upper middle class, nice, comfortable life. He was around people that bred things, bred pigeons, chickens, horses, dogs, cattle, and so forth. And if you selected parents, potential parents, brought them together, you might be able to drive certain changes in their offspring. Do you understand what I mean, right? Breeding. So that's unnatural selection. That's human-driven selection. Does nature have a way of selecting parents? Maybe it does. Maybe it's the strongest, the fastest, the most able to get food, the most able to make babies, which is what, incidentally, life is all about. I read a science magazine once, an article on this subject, where they like to, most of the time science will say, we never talk about purpose of life. That's religious folks, and that's metaphysics, and that's, we'll just talk about the mechanisms, but not the purpose. And then he said, but if you really ask us, and then they go on and talked about it. That was kind of funny to me. Anyway, it said, then the purpose of life is. Okay, that's what I just did. I just turned this off because it fell. Knocked it right off the back. So, this is being live streamed. Sorry about that, Pastor. Can you drop it in there? There we go. Thank you. And so, oh no, I'm on, good. I guess I can talk. So anyway, so the idea of humans selecting is one thing, that's unnatural, but nature selects them as well. So this is called survival of the fittest. That's what Darwin coined, that's what Darwin promoted. That's where Darwin made his money, basically. They made 1,000 copies, first edition, Origin of Species, and they sold out instantly. Why? Because the world at the time was ready for this. Now, there was a perfect storm for Darwinian evolution to catch on at the time it did. And that is a couple things. Number one, they're finding dinosaurs. Dinosaurs seemed to be not quite biblical, so they weren't quite sure what to do with that. They were finding things like Archaeopteryx fossils, which look like a half bird, half lizard. That kind of looked like what Darwin was talking about. They were finding human bones in a cave in Germany. God bless you. May your tribe increase. It would be grandkids, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, so they were finding human bones in a valley in Germany called Neander. In German, Neanderthal is Neander Valley. So all these things were happening at the time Darwin was talking, and it was a perfect storm for evolution to catch on. Anyway, but please notice this. Or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now remember, the purpose of the map-making tour is basically to map some areas, frankly, of the British Empire. Because the Brits, in the mid-1800s, were running the planet. The sun never set on the British Empire. They were everywhere. And Darwin accidentally found out why. If you remove God from the picture, and nature is the only one that's the force, the thing that's going on, then nature was favoring the British because the British were clearly the better ones of doing it. They were superior. Do you follow? Because if you only have nature, they were clearly superior. So this had implications immediately for social issues. Implications immediately. And that's why people like Adolf Hitler loved Charles Darwin. Because of this idea of nature selects superior races. And that sounded like what he personally believed. Anyway, that's just interesting. Okay, preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So let's keep going. If it could be demonstrated, said Darwin, that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would break down. So little tiny numerous changes is what he believed happened. Now, this is evolution's tree of life. That's Darwin's original drawing of what he thought it might be, evolution along that line. And notice he wrote up here, I think. But anyway, this has evolved into this. And so the idea is that life, and this is a separate question, and evolutionists don't particularly like to be cornered on this, and I get it. Why? They don't like to be cornered on the subject of where did life come from. That's a separate issue. But once life was here, then it evolved from some simple kind of cell, pre-plant, pre-animal, simple cell, changed into, some went into plants, others went into animals without backbones and animals with backbones. And we are up here with monkeys and lemurs because we look like them. And seriously, that's a simple answer. We look like them because things that look similar would have common ancestry. That's the idea. Okay, so that's evolution's tree of life. But we're going to talk today, when I do a talk on the flood, today, the biblical flood, was there evidence for it? We will talk about the fossil record, and we'll talk about how this is challenged by the fossil record, and we'll don't have time to do that now. So you got 19th century humanists. What's a humanist? The humanist simply believes that their worldview is that there is no God, man is it, and so it's up to man to fix things. Now Freud, in the world of psychology, was a 19th century humanist, and he said, forget about God, I'll tell you what human beings, how they tick, what makes them do what they do. Now, I've talked to psychology majors, and I say, is Freud still at the top of the list, or is Freud a little bit no longer accepted as the authority once was? And he said, yeah, he's sort of out now. Okay, so he's gone. Let's talk about Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, forget about God, I'll tell you how societies should and do operate. And that would be governments and so on. Without getting into a lot of argument right now, I think it's fair to say at least the 20th century saw that communism, which is Marx's form, is somewhat on the downslide. And we're just going to remove him from the picture as well. So Darwin said, forget about God, I'll tell you how we got here and how life changes over time. He is really the last great humanist of the 19th century, and he is defended very vigorously by modern humanists. Just real briefly, for instance, the eye was difficult to explain from little changes. Darwin knew this. To suppose that the eye, with all its contrivances for adjusting and focus and everything, happened through evolution, he says he admits that's kind of hard to imagine. Because understand that evolution suggests that eye started with a skin of a little patch of skin that was light sensitive, could tell where light was, and somehow could move the animal, whatever, according to the light orient itself. And somehow or other that evolved into the focusing, thing that we now call an eye. And he said how that could change, he admits, is difficult, but he believed it. Origin of species. Now, here's something that's, I think, pertinent to this whole subject, and that is what this man wrote about in the mid 1900s. He said, this is a Harvard-trained biologist. No, Harvard-trained, is he a biologist or physicist? No, he's a physicist, Harvard-trained physicist. And he was followed Aristotle, and he wanted to somehow get into Aristotle's brain, because Aristotle saw the whole universe as totally different than we do today. Earth, fire, wind, all this kind of elements and so forth. And he said, I want to understand how he got there. I want to see things the way he did. So he made it a personal quest. He eventually got there, and he said, well, then how did we change from him to us today? How do models change? And he wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he came up with a term that you're familiar with, and that's paradigm. Have you ever heard of paradigm? This is a man that coined that and made it popular. He took it from grammar technology and talked about a paradigm. And that's a view of how things, a model on how things are. And then he came up with the words paradigm shift. That was him who wrote this. And he said, even us scientists, and this was very controversial, operate from models, and we cling to the models. And it takes an immense amount of information to get away from an existing model. Now, science does not present itself that way. In fact, I was attracted to science partly because they were the most open-minded people I thought were on the planet. They would talk, this is my theory, but you got a better one? Man, I want to hear it because I want to learn and grow. I want to know as much as I can. Everybody has models they hold on to, and he suggested that his fellow scientists, along with him, held on to models. This was not a very well-accepted book when this came out, but now begrudgingly scientists will admit there's something to what he says. For instance, let's give me an example from history. Alchemy. What's alchemy? This is an early science, basically, before chemistry. Alchemy, every king worth his salt back in the Middle Ages had an alchemist on staff, paid with a laboratory. Why? Because they believed you got lead and you got gold. Gold is better. They're both heavy, they're both soft. How can we change lead into gold? And these guys were fully funded to make that happen. And for hundreds of years, they had this model. And for hundreds of years, they never did it. But they still did it, and why didn't they do it? Because it was more complex than they thought. Much more complex. In fact, if I can say this about science generally, you have a pothole in the road ahead of you, they will always hit it. They can't miss it. And this is the pothole they always hit. What they're looking at, they assume to be simpler than it is. And it always turns out to be more complicated. Let me give you an example. About a year ago, they had a flyby of a space probe that went by the planet Pluto. Remember that? I was excited about that. I started off science nerding as an astronomer, as a kid that just loved astronomy. I loved Pluto. I wanted to see Pluto. So when they finally got close enough to Pluto to take big pictures, I wanted to see them. And so, I'm going to give you my interpretation of the reaction of the scientists, literally with this camera there in front of them, as they were getting on their monitors these pictures from Pluto. First time ever, up close. They're like, "What? Huh?" Pluto was not a rock in space. Pluto was way more complex and more planety than they were expecting, with crust movements and everything else. It was more complex than they expected, and that is a common problem, frankly, in science. And you can have models that explain the same thing. You know what that is? You probably call it a light bulb. You know what that really is? That's a dark sucker. It sucks dark out of a room. What? You don't flip a switch and suddenly the dark is gone? So this gets it, and it stores it, and to the point to where it can't hold any more, and then it no longer functions, but you can see some of the dark residue still in there. There's an alternative model that more or less explains things, doesn't it? So you can have different models. You can have different models. Oh boy. Anyway, so when you're looking at nature and the universe, intelligent design is most definitely one way of looking at it, and undirected forces are most definitely another way. Oh, you've heard of these kind of illustrations a lot, and it's simply, what are the chances? In the beginning, God. If you had a monkey sit at a table and type out on a computer keyboard, how many times would it take for him to type out in the beginning, God? The sequence probability is 20 letters and spaces, 1 in 27 chance for the first one to be I, 1 in 27 times 27 for the second one to be in. Probability for getting all 20 is that number, which is about 1 in 50,000 trillion. If you believe in a 15 billion-year-old universe, and this monkey was working on this and changed every second, there's not been enough time yet for him to hit that sequence. So the point is, and this is some of the basic believers in intelligent design, like out of Seattle and these kind of people, are mathematicians because they work the odds. What are the chances of proteins coming together and so on? Anyway, in the beginning, God. So the human mind can see in nature things that appear to be randomly made. You look at mountains and you can imagine wind and erosion changing things. But when you see organization like that, you begin to suggest that there's more to the story. So Francis Crick said this: biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved. Why do they have to constantly keep, oh, no, that looks designed. No, it can't be designed. Looks designed, but no, it can't be designed. So why? Because they're operating from a model. And this is a Nobel Prize winner talking here. So again, talking about chances, let's say this is a marble, Colorado, and they're famous for a certain kind of rock. Could you guess what? Marble, good guess. This marble quarry produces some of the great statues and architecture in Washington, D.C. and everything. This is just the side view of their quarry. Let's assume for a minute that you'd have a block like this down at the base, and that through time, wind, erosion, maybe a deer kicked a piece of rock loose, something happened, and a little tiny pebble came rolling down the hill and eventually struck that cube you had there, knocked a little corner off. Pop, just like that. How many pieces would it take to make that? Or how many would it take to create that with breath and life and so forth? And really, that's what we're looking at. seriously. So it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to fit facts. Incidentally, creationists do the same thing. We operate with our own worldview. I interpret things that fit my worldview because I feel I've come to a conclusion with my worldview. But we all do that. We all interpret with the same glasses, and I admit that freely. Is it possible to do good science and still be a creationist? Anybody know who that man is? That's Wernher von Braun. And back in the day, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. If there is a single scientist most responsible for that happening, it's him. He was the head scientist for NASA at the time. And Wernher von Braun said this: religion and science are sisters, and one seeks knowledge of the creation and the other the creator. He was a creationist in his view of how we got here. You can do good science and still be a creationist. So I grew up in Los Angeles. Please don't hold that against me. And I was very much bombarded by Hollywood's view of science. The early view of scientists was not positive, right? You know, they would portray them as crazy, right? You know, mad scientists. Now science is given a much more positive image, right, in Hollywood. Back when I was a little boy, and that was back even before the day, there was a movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still. And in this movie, there was this guy that comes from outer space in a spaceship, and he lands and he tries to be incognito. He's a human-looking thing, and he tries to be incognito. He meets up with a little boy and becomes friends with him, and this is in Washington, D.C. And the best scientist in the world, the smartest man, according to the little boy, was a scientist that lived right there in Washington, D.C. And somehow or other, the two of them went there to talk about the future of the planet and science and so forth. And they go to meet this scientist. And this scientist, when he realizes this is a person from up there, he says, "Would you please sit down? I have 1,000 questions I want to ask you." Now, to me, that image of a scientist admitting that he has 1,000 questions and wanting to hear about somebody who would clearly have more information than he had, to me, that was a rosy image of science, and it drew me into wanting to be a scientist. I wanted to be a geologist. And so this is a classroom at UC Riverside, still there today, where my major professor had a class, and we were in it one day, and he said, "We have a creationist speaker coming to campus tonight." And then he giggled about it. And then he looked embarrassed that he had giggled, like, "Well, that wasn't nice, I shouldn't have giggled," kind of thing. And we're all watching him, of course. And then he kind of pauses and he says, "Well, I believe in God." And like all good college students anxious to avoid a quiz the next day, we got him off topic. But I was extremely curious to see what he was going to do. Now, I had a very light Christian background. I was in no way a practicing Christian. My family's idea of vacations was Las Vegas. You get the idea. Okay, so anyway, but I was favorable to the idea of God. I kind of assumed that makes sense in a lot of ways scientifically. That was about the extent of it. Anyway, I'm curious to see what he was going to do with God. So we asked him questions about his beliefs. And I'm listening to him avoid a few things. But a likable fellow. I really enjoyed him. I want you to understand, I think he was a wonderful gentleman. Very sincere in his beliefs. But clearly seemed to struggle with the idea where he was going to put God in the picture. So I finally asked my question, and this was it. Because I'm listening to him, and God became pretty small in his view. So I said, "So, Professor, are you saying then that nature was sufficient to create all that we see and organize it and evolve us into what we are today, and then there was a being out there in the universe who looked at this planet and said, those people are going to need a God. I think I'll go offer my services"? Now, I realize now I was a little sassy to say it that way, but if God had nothing to do with us being here, then who is he? Is he some kind of space alien or something? What is he? And he could not answer that. And I remember thinking, as soon as it was out of my mouth, that was not nice to put it that way. But he did not know what to do with God. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, science doesn't know quite what to do with God, or at least some science. So I knew that if I was going to continue in geology, I'd have to get a PhD. There was no other jobs unless you got a PhD. And then I was talking with some people about it and said, you know, I think the only place where you can be kind of open-minded about evolution and creation and all that, I think it's like Montana State University. And I'm from LA, and I was thinking, who lives in Bozeman, Montana? Who lives there? You know, out in the sticks? Oh, I mean, understand where I was coming from as a city kid. Anyway, and it was discouraging to me, and a lot of things were discouraging. I realized I'd have to fight professors and everything else on the subject, and I just didn't know what to do. Science was not now what it used to be for me, and I dropped out. Trying to figure out what I was doing for a while, I was a maintenance engineer at a McDonald's in Riverside, California for a while. And one day, my roommate was a day shift supervisor at another McDonald's. We had a McDonald's party. So we had people over on a Saturday night. And afterwards, my friend and I went to a Denny's restaurant, late night, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, cups of coffee, talking about where our lives were going. And we didn't like the direction they were going. We owned some things. We had a stereo. We had some cool stuff. And we were not happy with where we were and what was ahead of us. We weren't happy. There was no meaning, no purpose. And as we talked about it, and we knew we were a little bit in debt, my friend Dave has said, why don't we just sell everything we have and go move up and live off the land? Understand this was back in the day, okay? Live off the land. Get back to nature. And then he added this, and let's look for God. Oh, Dave? Really? Yeah, let's look for God. He was serious. Next day he asked me if he could borrow my Bible, and I said, yeah, I've got a Bible somewhere. Where have I got a Bible? Go dig around in my books and found it and gave it to him to read. And he started to read it, and I started to read it. And it was changing things, changing my worldview. And it had power. And I remember the day that I spoke to God for the first time, prayed to God for the first time since I was this high. And I went to the place where you're supposed to pray, next to the bed. So I kneeled next to the bed, and I prayed this prayer. God, it looks like Dave and I are looking for you. Can you help us? Amen. Think that got an answer? Things changed a lot in my life. We started to get answers to silly little prayers. Like, Dave, I think we ought to sell our sofa. Should we sell our sofa? Let's sell our sofa. You guys got a sofa for sale? Stuff like that. And we would go, he sees us. He hears us. We are on his radar, And that got very exciting. Eventually, we went to a series of meetings, evangelistic meetings, Pastor, at my friend's parents' church in Covina, California. And we went through the series, and it was really interesting. And at the end of it, we came up to what we think was a conference man, not the evangelist, but another church leader of some kind. Went up to them and he said, we want to help. We want to do something for the Lord. what can we do? Can we maybe go hand out literature on an Indian reservation or something? Because that sounded cool. I had a Volkswagen van. You get the idea. He smiled, he looked at us, and he said, just get back into school. I'm back into school? Well, I've got all my science stuff. I've already done a couple of years of, more than 2 years of that. That's all done. I'd be studying religion. Oh, I'd be studying religion. That would be awesome. I would love to study about God and learn from professors who knew things about God and everything. Yeah, so that was an easy decision for me. I showed up at a place called La Sierra College and came in the door, and school was starting in a couple of days. And I said, I'd like to go to school here. I don't have any money. Is that a problem? And the lady was really nice. She laughed and she said, well, let's see what we can do. And for 2 years, I had nothing but solid religion classes, and I was in heaven. I was just enjoying it so much. And then at the end of that, I got hired by a conference, and they called me pastor. But I've never, ever lost my interest in any way for science, and earth science especially. And so I kind of think these issues are important in the days in which we're living right now. The subject of, does science really, truly support this model of nature's enough? And that's kind of where we go. Oh, incidentally, there I am. Okay, just thought you'd like to see that picture and get a good laugh. I show it to kids in schools when I'm talking to schools, and it's hard to get them to stop laughing. Anyway. The only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics. Nearly every present-day scientist would agree with Carl Sagan that our explanations of material phenomena exclude any role for supernatural demons, spirits, witches, including the supreme extraterrestrial. We have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. Despite any evidence we get contrary, it's our model. For we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's Richard Lewontin in Harvard University. Biology. So you see the model, we are defending this model to the death. Kind of interesting. Anyway, cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And yet, materialism is basically the idea that material is all we got. It's not Mercedes-Benz's. It's in the science world. It is material begets material. All material comes from material. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made from what was visible. We have a non-materialistic view. Incidentally, science is now shifting over to this. Have you ever heard of dark energy and dark matter? So now they believe a lot of the stuff that is involved with us being here you can't even detect. And so they call it dark energy and dark matter. It's interesting. So I joke with them a little bit. Hey, you guys have come over. We're with you on this. Not everything that you see. You can't see everything that is out there. It's kind of fun. So I'm going to conclude with this story. This is what city? Athens, correct. This is the Areopagus up at the top there. And this is a story about the Apostle Paul from the New Testament. Paul was a very learned man. He'd have the equivalent of a PhD. Now, while Paul, the apostle, was waiting for them, his colleagues in Athens, his spirit was provoked when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Totally different worldview than he had. He was going around looking at this. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Now, Epicurean, Stoic. Epicureans followed Epicurus. And that is a belief that the gods are not involved in the world. They're having too much fun having fun, too busy. Mankind should, don't worry, be happy. And this is it. There's no other afterlife, right? Epicurus. So have fun now while you can. Then the Stoics followed Zeno. And Zeno went the other direction a little bit. And he said, it's all about learning, education. God is in nature, not above it. Man's happiness comes from overcoming wrong attitudes through increased knowledge. The more knowledge you have, the more divine, right? There is no, afterlife. There's the one area they agreed on. Others said about Paul, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this doctrine is of what you speak. Now that little rock there is where they were meeting with him. They brought him there to talk. That rock is still there today. So, understand this about about Paul. In a previous time, a governor said that, Paul, you're beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. He was a very educated man. Education was not an issue for him. In fact, when I talk about this in front of kids, I say, college students, so have you ever felt like Paul, that much education is driving you mad? Anyway, I usually get a very, very responsive amen, kind of thing. All right. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Well, see, now you admit that you don't know everything that's up there. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I understand. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim to you. Now, here is the worldview that he proclaims. A big God. Understand, it's all about your image of God. If you believe in God at all, how big is he? That's literally as simple as it gets. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. Not worship with men's hands, man bringing a sacrifice or a gift. He doesn't need it, because he's got everything. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. He's above anything you can conceive of. Okay? Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. That means change direction, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. Now, there's a resurrection. There's where they pushed their buttons. Okay, their buttons got pushed. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. A divine being that made heaven and earth, a creator who gives and actively maintains the life of all creatures, is sustaining life right now, is actively connected in this world right now. Someone who can't be contained in temple, nor is properly represented by man's reason or art. A God whom we are responsible to, a divinity above natural laws and fully capable of suspending them at his will, like raising somebody from the dead. Okay? They mocked at that. Some mocked, but you know what? Not everybody. Some believed. Some believed, and some had a paradigm shift. When I'm talking with evolutionists on the subject, a paradigm shift, I said, in Christianity, we call a paradigm shift conversion. Okay, now look at this man. Two people, I'll show you a picture. Although I was passionately and totally persuaded of truth and relevance of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. This is a colleague of Richard Dawkins at Oxford University. He writes that. So, paradigm shift. It is possible to have a paradigm shift. It is possible to look at all the evidence, and man, I could talk about this all day, and I will, if you give me a chance. Talk about this all day, because good science that comes at things, there's data and there's interpretation. You understand the difference? Data, interpretation. We have rocks that are decayed. How do you interpret decayed rocks? Millions of years. Things like that. We'll talk about that today if you are interested, because we're going to do a couple of seminars, Pastor, in the afternoon after a potluck. And so we'll talk about dinosaurs, we'll talk about the flood, and I will be able to answer questions as needed. So, thank you for your patience. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me give a little direction here for our guests this morning. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. If you have any children in our Bible classes, they'll be released here very shortly. Down the hall is where their classes. If you took them there, you probably know where they're at. For those of you who may not be familiar with, well, let's see if this is maybe your first time. My name is Pastor Edward Nelson. I am privileged to pastor this church. I'm very thankful to be here. And if you need a facility, bathroom, or the drinking fountain, you'll find it out the double doors to the left, just behind the staircase. There's multiple sets of bathrooms there, as well as the drinking fountain. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back here. But let's have a word of prayer before we do. Father, thank you as we look into the world that you've created for us, we realize, Father, that we are small, and that what you have done for us is vastly profound and beautiful. And you've done it, Father, because you're a creator, you are an artist, you are powerful. And Father, we're still wrestling with those things, and I know that we're never going to completely understand them. But that's a good thing, because there's always going to be something to discover and be taught and learn from you. Father, be with us this morning as we continue, as Stan shares with us again, and as we go into our worship service, and bless those who have come. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.